The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the third time. At 28, he had served as one of the Queen's Guards for 6 years, but, today felt different. Something in the crisp autumn air made him more aware of the people gathering outside the palace gates than usual. James had always taken pride in his role. Standing motionless for hours, rifle in hand, bearskin hat perfectly positioned, was more than just a job, it was an honor. The tourists would come and go, taking pictures, trying to make him smile or move. He had mastered the art of remaining statue still, his dark eyes fixed straight ahead, never acknowledging the crowds that gathered daily to witness the changing of the guard. But, lately, something had been bothering him. Maybe it was the letter from his grandfather that arrived last week, or perhaps the conversation he overheard between 2 elderly visitors the previous day. His grandfather, a World War II veteran, had written about feeling invisible in his nursing home. "Nobody sees old soldiers anymore, James," the letter had said. "We're just reminders of wars people want to forget." As James took his position at the main gate, he noticed an elderly man standing apart from the usual crowd of tourists. The man wore a worn military jacket with faded medals pinned to his chest. His gray hair was neatly combed, and, his posture, despite his age, still held traces of military bearing. But, there was something in his eyes that made James's chest tighten, a loneliness that seemed to reach across the distance between them. The old soldier stood there for nearly an hour, not taking pictures or chatting with other visitors. He simply watched the guards with a respect that James recognized. It was the way one soldier acknowledges another, across generations and circumstances. The man's weathered hands shook slightly as he held a small wreath of poppies, and James could see him whispering something under his breath. During his brief break between shifts, James learned from a colleague that the elderly visitor had been coming to the palace every November for the past 5 years. His name was Albert Thompson, and he was 93 years old. Albert had served in North Africa during World War II and lost his best friend during the Battle of El Alamein. Every year, he came to pay his respects at the palace, though he had no official reason to be there. That afternoon, as James returned to his post, he saw Albert sitting on a nearby bench. The old man looked exhausted, and his breathing seemed labored. A group of teenagers had gathered around him, not out of respect, but to mock his military decorations. One of them was making jokes about old war stories, while another pretended to march like a soldier in an exaggerated, disrespectful manner. James felt his jaw clench beneath his ceremonial chin strap. The regulations were clear: guards must remain motionless and silent during their duty. Breaking protocol could result in serious disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the regiment. But, watching Albert's dignity being trampled by thoughtless young people made something inside James rebel against the rules he had followed without question for years. The teenagers grew bolder, with one of them reaching toward Albert's medals. The old man tried to stand, clearly wanting to leave, but his legs seemed unsteady. James saw him reach for his walking stick, which had fallen to the ground during the commotion. The young people laughed louder, treating Albert's struggle as entertainment. In that moment, James thought about his grandfather's letter again. He thought about all the elderly veterans he had seen over the years, standing proudly but silently at various ceremonies, their sacrifices acknowledged with polite applause but little genuine recognition. He thought about Albert, who had traveled here alone, carrying his small wreath and his heavy memories. Something shifted in James's chest, a warmth that spread through his rigid posture. Without thinking about the consequences, he took a small step forward. It was barely noticeable to most observers, but it was a violation of his standing orders. The teenagers, still laughing, didn't notice. But Albert did. The old veteran's eyes met James's for just a moment. In that brief exchange, something passed between them: understanding, respect, recognition. Albert's shoulders straightened slightly, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. He managed to retrieve his walking stick and slowly stood up, his dignity intact despite the continued mockery around him. As Albert walked away, he paused near James's position. Without looking directly at the guard, he whispered, "Thank you, son." The words were so quiet that only James could hear them, but they resonated through him like thunder. That evening, back in his quarters, James couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He had broken protocol for the first time in his career, and, though no one had reported it, he felt both guilty and, strangely liberated. He thought about the military code that demanded respect for veterans, about the oath he had taken to serve with honor, and about the human connection that had sparked between him and Albert. His roommate, Corporal David Hayes, noticed his unusual quietness. David had been in the Guards for 4 years and had always been more relaxed about the rules. "You look like you've seen a ghost," David said, settling onto his bunk with a cup of tea. "Maybe I have," James replied, then found himself telling David about Albert and the teenagers, about his grandfather's letter, and about the moment when he had stepped forward. David listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully. "My gran always said that rules are important, but kindness is sacred," he said finally. "Maybe there's a way to honor both." That night, James lay awake thinking about David's words. He began to form an idea, something that would allow him to show respect for veterans like Albert while still maintaining his duties as a guard. It would require careful planning and the cooperation of his fellow guardsmen, but it might be possible. The next morning brought new visitors to the palace, including a group from a local nursing home. Among them was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, wearing a nurse's uniform from the Second World War. Her name tag read Margaret, and her eyes held the same depth of experience that James had seen in Albert's gaze. As the group moved through the courtyard, James noticed that Margaret was struggling to see over the crowd of tourists. The nursing home attendant was overwhelmed, trying to manage 12 elderly residents while tourists pushed and jostled for better positions. Margaret's wheelchair was stuck behind a large family with multiple children, and her frustration was evident. This time, James didn't hesitate. During a brief moment when the tourist crowd shifted, he caught the eye of his fellow Guardsman Peters, and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Peters, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Palace Guard, understood immediately. With military precision disguised as routine movement, both guards adjusted their positions slightly, creating a clear line of sight for Margaret. The movement was so subtle that most tourists didn't notice, but Margaret saw everything. Her weathered face lit up with surprise and gratitude as she suddenly had an unobstructed view of the ceremony. The nursing home attendant, a young woman named Sarah, noticed the guard's subtle assistance and felt tears spring to her eyes. She had been working with elderly veterans and wartime nurses for 3 years, and she knew how much these visits meant to them. To see the guards acknowledge her resident service, even in such a small way, touched something deep in her heart. After the ceremony, as the nursing home group prepared to leave, Margaret asked Sarah to wheel her closer to where James stood. The old nurse reached into her purse and pulled out a small pin, a tiny poppy that she had worn on her uniform during the war. "Give this to that young man," she whispered to Sarah, her voice trembling with emotion. "Tell him it's from one who served to another who serves." Sarah approached James during his next break, explaining Margaret's request. As she handed him the small pin, she said, "She wanted you to know that she sees you, and she appreciates what you did today." James took the pin with hands that shook slightly. It was such a small thing, barely larger than a button, but it represented something enormous. It was recognition, gratitude, and connection across generations of service. He carefully tucked it into his pocket, knowing he would treasure it forever. Word of the guard's subtle acts of kindness began to spread among the staff at the palace. Captain Williams, the commanding officer, heard various reports but chose to interpret them as excellent crowd management rather than protocol violations. He had served in Northern Ireland and understood the importance of maintaining military discipline while also showing human compassion. Over the following days, James found himself noticing elderly visitors more acutely. There was the old man who came every Tuesday, always wearing his Royal Navy cap, who struggled with the steep steps near the East Gate. There was the elderly woman who visited with her great-grandchildren, proudly pointing out the guards while her family seemed more interested in their phones than her stories about meeting Prince Philip during her service as a wren. Each observation added to James's growing understanding of how invisible many elderly veterans and service members had become. They carried their histories quietly, their sacrifices acknowledged in official ceremonies but often overlooked in daily life. They deserved more than polite indifference, and James began to see his role not just as a ceremonial guardian of the palace, but as someone who could honor their service. The idea that had been forming in his mind since meeting Albert began to take clearer shape. He started discussing it with David and some of the other guards during their off-duty hours. The response was more positive than he had expected. Many of his colleagues had their own stories about grandparents or elderly neighbors who had served their country with distinction but now felt forgotten. Guardsman Peters shared a story about his grandfather, who had landed at Normandy on D-Day but rarely talked about it. He says nobody wants to hear old war stories, Peters explained. But, when he does talk about it, you can see how much it still means to him. Corporal Hayes told them about his grandmother, who had worked in a munitions factory during the war. She's 91 now, and, when people ask what she did during the war, they lose interest as soon as she mentions factory work. They don't understand that making bullets and shells was just as important as firing them. As these conversations continued, a plan began to emerge. It would require careful coordination and absolute discretion, but it might be possible to create moments of recognition and respect for elderly veterans and service members without compromising their official duties or violating regulations. The plan was simple in concept but would require precision in execution. During certain ceremonies and changing of the guard, when movements and formations allowed for it, the guards would make subtle acknowledgments to elderly veterans in the crowd. These would not be dramatic gestures that would disrupt the ceremony or draw media attention, but small, dignified actions that would be meaningful to those who understood their significance. James spent hours studying the guard routines, identifying moments when brief, respectful acknowledgments would be possible. He consulted with senior guards who had served longer and understood the nuances of palace protocol. Slowly, carefully, a network of like-minded guardsmen began to form. The first official test of their plan came the following week when a group of Normandy veterans was scheduled to visit the palace. These men, all in their late 90s, were among the last surviving members of their regiment. For many of them, this would likely be their final visit to such an important ceremonial location. As James prepared for duty that morning, he felt the weight of Margaret's poppy pin in his pocket and thought about Albert's quiet dignity. Today would be different. Today, he and his fellow guards would show that true military service means honoring those who came before, regardless of protocol or convenience. The morning sun climbed higher as the veterans group approached the palace gates, their wheelchairs and walking frames moving slowly but steadily toward a moment that would change everything James thought he knew about duty, honor, and the real meaning of service. The wheelchair convoy moved slowly through the palace gates, each vehicle carrying a piece of living history. James watched from his position as 12 Normandy veterans, their average age 97, approached the ceremonial area where the changing of the guard would take place. Some wore their original military berets, others had medals pinned to cardigans and jackets. All carried themselves with the quiet dignity of men who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to believe in the best. Leading the group was Harold Winters, a former sergeant who had been among the first waves of soldiers to land on Omaha Beach. At 98, he was legally blind but insisted on attending these ceremonies because, as he told anyone who would listen, I can still hear the bugles, and that's enough. Beside him sat Thomas Bryden, a former medic who had spent D-Day pulling wounded soldiers from the surf, his hands now gnarled with arthritis but steady enough to hold the small Union Jack he brought to every ceremony. James felt his heart rate increase as the moment approached. He and 7 other guards had spent the previous evening rehearsing their plan in the privacy of the barracks. Each movement had been carefully choreographed to appear as natural parts of the ceremony while carrying deeper meaning for those who would understand. Captain Williams had noticed their extra practice sessions but chose not to inquire, perhaps sensing that something important was taking place. As the ceremony began, James took his position in the formation. The tourists gathered in their usual spots, phones and cameras ready, chattering about the spectacle they were about to witness. But the veterans sat in respectful silence, their eyes focused not on the pageantry but on the young soldiers who represented the continuation of their service. Harold Winters had positioned his wheelchair at the front of the veterans section. Despite his blindness, he sat at perfect attention, his back straight and his hands folded precisely in his lap. The discipline of 75 years ago was still there, ingrained in his very bones. Thomas Brighton sat beside him, quietly explaining the movements of the ceremony to his friend, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had once guided wounded men to safety. When the moment came, James felt everything slow down around him. As the formation turned toward the veterans section, he made eye contact with Harold, knowing the old man couldn't see him but somehow sensing his attention. Then, with a movement so subtle that most observers would miss it entirely, James tilted his head forward in the smallest possible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one soldier to another. The effect was immediate. Harold's weathered face transformed, a smile breaking across his features like sunrise after a long night. He whispered something to Thomas, who looked up sharply at James, his eyes filling with tears. Within moments, the recognition spread through the group of veterans like ripples on a pond. Guardsman Peters, standing 3 positions to James's left, caught the eye of a veteran wearing a Royal Air Force pin and offered his own subtle salute, a slight adjustment of his rifle position that carried all the weight of military respect. Corporal Hayes, positioned near the rear of the formation, allowed his gaze to linger on an elderly woman wearing a nurse's service medal, acknowledging her contribution with a brief but meaningful glance. The ceremony continued according to protocol, but something fundamental had changed. The tourists continued taking pictures and videos, unaware that they were witnessing history being honored in the most personal way possible. But the veterans understood. After decades of feeling invisible, of having their stories dismissed or forgotten, they were being seen by the next generation of British soldiers. Edith Morrison, the former nurse, had to reach for her handkerchief as she watched the young guards acknowledge her service. At 95, she had spent the war years patching up soldiers not much older than these guardsmen, working 18-hour shifts in field hospitals across Europe. For years after the war, she had struggled with what doctors now called PTSD, but, in those days was simply called, being difficult. The recognition from these young soldiers touched a part of her heart that had been closed for decades. As the formal ceremony concluded, an unexpected moment occurred. Harold Winters, despite his blindness and frailty, slowly raised his right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. The gesture was unplanned, unscripted, and absolutely unmistakable. For 30 seconds, the old soldier held his salute while the young guards maintained their positions. James felt his chest tighten with emotion. Here was a man who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, who had fought across Europe, who had helped liberate concentration camps and rebuild a continent. At 98 years old, blind and confined to a wheelchair, he was still every inch a soldier. Without hesitation, James returned the salute, holding the position until Harold slowly lowered his hand. The moment might have caused a diplomatic incident or a breach of protocol investigation, but something magical happened instead. A photographer from a local newspaper, there to cover the routine ceremony, captured the exchange between Harold and James. But, rather than treating it as a violation of royal protocol, he recognized it as something far more significant, a bridge between generations of service members, a moment of pure military honor that transcended regulations. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed, the veterans group remained in the courtyard. Their caregiver, a patient woman named Helen who had been organizing these trips for 15 years, was in conversation with palace staff about the possibility of a brief meet and greet with some of the guards during their break period. Captain Williams, who had observed the entire ceremony from a strategic position, approached Helen with measured steps. His expression was unreadable, and James felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Had their plan backfired? Were they about to face disciplinary action for their breach of protocol? "Miss Henderson," the captain said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "I believe some of my guardsmen would consider it an honor to meet these gentlemen properly, if time permits." Helen's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Really? That would mean the world to them. They've been talking about this visit for months. What followed was one of the most moving 20 minutes of James's military career. During their scheduled break, 6 of the guards were permitted to approach the veterans in their civilian clothes, without their ceremonial weapons and bearskin hats. The conversation that ensued was unlike anything James had experienced. Harold Winters, still sharp despite his age and blindness, immediately recognized James's voice when he introduced himself. "You're the young man who saluted me," Harold said, extending a trembling hand. "I felt it, you know. Even though I couldn't see you, I felt the respect in that gesture." James clasped the old soldier's hand, amazed by the strength still present in those weathered fingers. "Sir, it was an honor to acknowledge your service. Thank you for what you did for all of us." Thomas Brighton pulled out a worn leather wallet and extracted a black and white photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers on a beach, their faces streaked with sand and exhaustion but their eyes bright with determination. "That's us on June 7, 1944, Thomas explained. "The day after D-Day. We just finished setting up a field hospital." James studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the fresh-faced young men in the image with the elderly veterans before him. The transformation was startling, but, when he looked closely, he could still see traces of those young soldiers in their eyes, the same determination, the same quiet courage. Edith Morrison had wheeled herself closer to the group. She listened to the men's stories with the patience of someone who had heard them many times before but understood their importance. When there was a lull in the conversation, she spoke up. "You boys remind me of the soldiers I used to patch up," she said, her voice still carrying traces of the authority she once wielded in field hospitals. "Same bearing, same dedication. Different war, same spirit." Corporal Hayes knelt beside her wheelchair. "What was it like, ma'am? Being a nurse during the war?" Edith's eyes grew distant. "Terrifying, exhausting, heartbreaking, and the most important work I ever did. We lost so many boys your age, with your faces, your hopes. But, we saved many more. Every life we saved was a victory against the darkness." As the conversation continued, James began to understand something that hadn't been taught in any military training course. These elderly veterans weren't just history to be honored in abstract terms, they were living links to the values and traditions that gave meaning to military service. Their stories weren't just tales of past heroism, they were guidebooks for how to serve with honor, courage, and humanity. The photographer who had captured the salute exchange approached the group hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said to Captain Williams, "but I think I've captured something special today. Would it be possible to share this story? I think people need to see this kind of connection between generations." Captain Williams considered the request carefully. Military protocol usually discouraged unauthorized media attention, but something about the day's events had moved him as well. "What kind of story are you thinking of telling?" "The truth," the photographer replied simply. "That honor and respect transcend generations. That these young soldiers understand the debt they owe to these veterans. That the spirit of service continues." The captain nodded slowly. "I believe that would be appropriate, with the veterans' permission, of course." Harold Winters spoke up from his wheelchair. "Son, we've been invisible for too long. If our story can help people understand what service really means, then, tell it." As the veterans prepared to leave, each of them made a point of shaking hands with the guards who had acknowledged them. The simple gesture of recognition had transformed what could have been just another tourist photo opportunity into something profound and lasting. Thomas Brighton pulled James aside as the group prepared to depart. "I want you to have something," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small metal pin, a medic's cross, worn smooth by decades of handling. "I've carried this since D-Day. It belonged to my medical kit. I think it's time it went to someone who understands what service really means." James accepted the pin with trembling hands. "Sir, I can't take this. It's too important." "That's exactly why you should have it," Thomas replied. "Important things need to be passed on to people who will value them. You've shown me that the spirit of service is alive and, well, in your generation." As the convoy of wheelchairs and walking frames slowly made their way back toward the palace gates, James felt a profound shift in his understanding of his role. He had joined the Queen's Guard for the honor and tradition, but today he had discovered that true honor came not from perfect adherence to protocol, but from recognizing and respecting the human stories that gave meaning to military service. That evening, in the barracks, the guards who had participated in the day's events gathered to talk about what had happened. The conversation wasn't celebratory or self-congratulatory, it was thoughtful and serious, as if they all understood that they had crossed some important threshold. "I keep thinking about what that nurse said," Guardsman Peters reflected. "About us reminding her of the soldiers she used to treat. Makes you realize we're part of something bigger than ourselves." David Hayes nodded. "My grandfather always said that military service was about protecting something precious. I think I finally understand what he meant. It's not just about the country or the crown, it's about the people who came before us and the people who will come after." James fingered Thomas Brighton's medic pin in his pocket. "I think we found something today," he said quietly. "A way to honor our duty while honoring the people who made our service possible." The conversation continued late into the evening, but already plans were forming for how to continue what they had started. Word was spreading through the regiment about what had happened, and other guards were expressing interest in participating. Captain Williams, while maintaining official neutrality, seemed to be quietly supportive of their efforts. The photograph from that day's ceremony would eventually be published in several newspapers, but the real impact was happening in smaller, more personal ways. The veterans who had been acknowledged went home and shared their stories with family members who hadn't heard them speak about military service in years. The guards began to see their ceremonial duties in a new light, understanding them not just as tradition but as living connections to the sacrifices that made their service possible. As James settled into his bunk that night, he thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment, from his grandfather's letter about feeling invisible, to Albert Thompson standing alone with his poppy wreath, to Harold Winters's perfect salute. Each encounter had taught him something about the weight of military service and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors, and new opportunities to bridge the gap between past and present service. The protocols and regulations would remain the same, but James now understood that there were ways to honor both military discipline and human dignity simultaneously. The last thing he did before sleep was to carefully pin Thomas Brighton's medic cross inside his military jacket, right over his heart. It would be invisible to observers, but he would know it was there, a reminder of the medical corpsmen who had saved lives on D-Day and the chain of service that connected them across 75 years. In the darkness of the barracks, James smiled as he realized that tomorrow would bring Albert Thompson back to the palace for his weekly visit. This time, the old soldier wouldn't be standing alone with his memories. This time, he would be acknowledged by guardsmen who understood that honoring the past was the truest form of military service. 3 weeks after the ceremony with the Normandy veterans, word had spread through London's tight-knit military community about the guards who had begun acknowledging elderly service members. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond what James and his colleagues had ever imagined when they first decided to honor Albert Thompson's quiet dignity. The ripple effects were becoming visible throughout the city. Veterans organizations were organizing more visits to the palace, knowing that their members would be treated with genuine respect rather than mere ceremonial politeness. Care homes were requesting special trips to see the changing of the guard, and families were bringing elderly relatives who had served but rarely talked about their experiences. James arrived for his morning shift to find an unexpected sight in the courtyard. A group of about 30 elderly people had gathered, but these weren't tourists or organized veterans groups. These were individuals who had come on their own, drawn by stories they had heard from friends or read in newspapers. Among them, he recognized Albert Thompson, still carrying his poppy wreath, but now he wasn't alone. Standing beside Albert was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple blue coat, but pinned to her lapel was a small badge that made James's breath catch, the insignia of the Special Operations Executive, the secret organization that had sent agents behind enemy lines during World War II. This woman, who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, was a former spy. Her name was Catherine Walsh, though during the war she had operated under the code name Sparrow. At 91, she rarely spoke about her wartime service, but Albert's story about being acknowledged by the palace guards had stirred something in her memory. She had decided to make the journey from her small flat in Camden to see for herself if the stories were true. As James took his position, he noticed other remarkable individuals in the growing crowd. There was an elderly black man wearing a Jamaican flag pin alongside his Royal Air Force badge, one of the Caribbean airmen who had served with distinction in the RAF but had faced discrimination both during and after the war. Next to him stood an elderly Sikh gentleman, his white turban perfectly arranged, wearing medals from campaigns in Burma where Sikh regiments had fought with exceptional courage. The diversity of service represented in that courtyard was staggering, yet James realized that most of these people had never been celebrated in the way that more traditional military heroes had been. Their stories had been marginalized, their contributions overlooked or forgotten. They were the invisible veterans, the ones whose service had been vital but whose recognition had been delayed by decades. Captain Williams had arrived early that morning and immediately noticed the unusual gathering. Rather than expressing concern about the potential disruption to routine operations, he spent several minutes walking through the crowd, speaking quietly with various veterans. When he returned to the guard's briefing area, his expression was thoughtful. "Gentlemen," he addressed the assembled guards, "today we have an opportunity to demonstrate what military service really means. I expect you to conduct yourselves with the highest level of professionalism and honor." The words might have seemed like standard protocol to an outside observer, but James understood the deeper message. Captain Williams was giving them permission to continue their practice of acknowledging elderly veterans, while maintaining the plausible deniability required by military regulations. As the ceremony began, James felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. These weren't just tourists seeking entertainment, these were people who had served their country and were seeking recognition for their sacrifices. Some had waited 70 years for this moment of acknowledgement from the military community they had once been part of. Catherine Walsh had positioned herself where she could see clearly, despite her small stature. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, tracked every movement of the guards with the analytical precision of someone trained to notice details. She was watching not just the ceremony, but the guards themselves, trying to determine if the stories she had heard were true. When the moment came, James made his choice. As the formation moved through its prescribed positions, he allowed his gaze to sweep across the section where the elderly veterans stood. When his eyes met Catherine's, he saw a flash of recognition, not just of his acknowledgement, but of the courage it took to step outside protocol for the sake of honoring service. Catherine had spent 3 years during the war operating behind German lines, coordinating resistance activities and gathering intelligence. She had been captured twice and escaped both times. She had seen young soldiers die for causes they believed in, and she had made life and death decisions that affected the outcome of entire operations. But, in this moment, receiving acknowledgement from a young guard who chose honor over regulation, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of belonging to the military family again. The elderly Jamaican RAF veteran, Winston Campbell, had noticed the exchange between James and Catherine. At 88, Winston had served as a navigator on bombing missions over Germany, facing both enemy fire and racial prejudice within his own squadron. After the war, he had struggled to find work despite his exemplary service record. For most of his life, his contributions had been minimized or ignored entirely. When Guardsman Peters offered him the subtlest of nods, Winston felt his chest swell with pride. It was a small gesture, but, for someone who had spent decades feeling invisible, it carried enormous weight. The young guard was acknowledging not just his individual service, but the service of all the Commonwealth troops who had fought for Britain during the war. The Sikh veteran, Hardeep Singh, had served with the 4th Indian Division in Burma, fighting in some of the most brutal jungle warfare of the Second World War. His regiment had been instrumental in stopping the Japanese advance toward India, but their contributions had been largely forgotten in popular accounts of the war. When Corporal Hayes made eye contact with him and offered a respectful bow of his head, Hardeep felt tears he hadn't shed in years beginning to form. As the ceremony continued, something unprecedented began to happen. Word had spread through London that the palace guards were acknowledging elderly veterans, and more people began arriving. A group of elderly women who had worked in code-breaking at Bletchley Park made their way to the palace, having traveled together on public transport from their retirement community. A small group of former Land Army workers, women who had kept British agriculture running during the war, arrived wearing their old work badges. The crowd was growing beyond what anyone had anticipated, and palace security began to take notice. James could see officers speaking into their radios, clearly concerned about the unusual gathering. But, rather than dispersing the crowd, something remarkable happened. Senior palace staff began moving through the group, engaging elderly veterans in conversation and ensuring they had clear views of the ceremony. Among the palace staff was Elizabeth Hartwell, a senior protocol officer who had worked at the palace for 25 years. Her own grandfather had been killed in the First World War, and she had grown up hearing stories about his service from her grandmother. Seeing the elderly veterans gathered in the courtyard reminded her why the palace existed, not just as a symbol of monarchy, but as a representation of the nation's values and history. Elizabeth quietly coordinated with security to ensure that the elderly visitors were comfortable and safe. Water was provided for those who needed it, and chairs were discreetly positioned for veterans who had difficulty standing for extended periods. The palace staff, taking their cue from the guards' respectful acknowledgments, began treating the gathering as an honor guard for living history rather than a potential security concern. As news of the gathering spread through social media and text messages, more people began arriving. Family members came with elderly relatives who had served but rarely spoke about their experiences. Adult children pushed parents in wheelchairs, grandchildren walked alongside grandparents, and the crowd became a multi-generational celebration of military service. Among the newcomers was Maria Santos, a 45-year-old teacher who had brought her 83-year-old father, Carlos. Carlos had served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands War, but had struggled with what is now recognized as PTSD for decades after his return. He rarely left his house and had not spoken about his military service in years. But Maria had read about the guards acknowledging veterans and convinced her father to make the journey to the palace. Carlos stood quietly in the crowd, overwhelmed by the number of people and the noise of the gathering. But when one of the guards, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Carlos had been during the Falklands, made brief eye contact with him and offered the slightest nod of recognition, something shifted in the older man's posture. For the first time in years, Carlos felt like a veteran rather than a victim. The ceremony was now running longer than usual, as the guards found subtle ways to acknowledge the growing crowd of elderly service members. Captain Williams, monitoring the situation from his command position, made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He extended the ceremony by 15 minutes, allowing time for more complete acknowledgements while maintaining the formal structure required by protocol. During this extended period, an elderly woman named Rose Patel approached the barrier area carrying a small wooden box. At 79, Rose had served as a military nurse in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, treating soldiers and civilians alike under extremely dangerous conditions. The wooden box contained letters of thanks from soldiers she had treated, along with a few small mementos from her service. Rose had heard about the Guards acknowledging elderly veterans and had traveled from Manchester specifically for this moment. But, as she stood in the crowd, she began to doubt her decision. She wasn't a combat veteran like the men around her, and she worried that her service wasn't significant enough to warrant recognition. James, during a brief pause in the ceremony, noticed Rose standing uncertainly at the edge of the crowd. Something about her hesitation and the careful way she held the small box told him that she was a veteran who needed acknowledgement. When their eyes met, he offered her the same respectful recognition he had given the others, and Rose's face transformed with relief and gratitude. The impact of that single moment would extend far beyond the ceremony itself. Rose returned to Manchester and, for the first time in years, began sharing her stories about military nursing with her family and community. The wooden box that had sat untouched in her closet for decades became the centerpiece of presentations she gave at local schools about the role of military nurses during the Troubles. As the extended ceremony concluded, something extraordinary happened that no one had planned. Harold Winters, the 98-year-old D-Day veteran who had been part of the original Normandy group, had returned to the palace in his wheelchair. Despite his blindness and frailty, he had insisted on coming back to witness what he called the awakening. As the final formations moved through their positions, Harold slowly raised himself from his wheelchair with the help of his walking frame. Standing as straight as his aged body would allow, he rendered a perfect military salute to the young guards who had shown such respect for his generation of veterans. This time, it wasn't just James who returned the salute. All 8 guards on duty acknowledged Harold's gesture in unison. The sight of 8 young guardsmen saluting a blind, 98-year-old D-Day veteran became the defining image of that day. Photographers captured the moment from multiple angles, but the real impact wasn't in the pictures, it was in the faces of the elderly veterans who witnessed it, in the tears of family members who saw their relatives honored, and in the understanding that passed between generations of military service members. After the ceremony, Captain Williams made an unprecedented decision. He authorized a brief informal meet and greet period, allowing the guards to interact with veterans during their break. What followed was 90 minutes of conversation that bridged 70 years of military history. Catherine Walsh found herself in conversation with Guardsman Peters about the evolution of military intelligence work. The elderly SOE veteran, who had spent decades keeping silent about her wartime activities, discovered that she could share some of her experiences with a young soldier who understood operational security and the weight of classified responsibilities. Winston Campbell talked with Corporal Hayes about the role of Commonwealth forces in British military history, sharing stories about RAF operations that had never been included in official histories. The young corporal, whose own family had immigrated from Jamaica 2 generations earlier, felt a profound connection to Winston's experiences of serving Britain while facing discrimination. Hardeep Singh spoke with James about the Burma campaign and the role of Indian forces in the Second World War. The elderly Sikh veteran had brought photographs from his service, including images of his regiment receiving commendations for their courage in jungle warfare. James was amazed to learn about military actions and strategies that had never been covered in his military education. These conversations continued throughout the afternoon, as more family members arrived to collect their elderly relatives and found themselves drawn into discussions about military history and the evolution of British forces. Children and grandchildren heard stories they had never heard before, as the acknowledgement from the guard seemed to unlock decades of carefully guarded memories. Maria Santos watched her father Carlos engage in his first conversation about military service in over a decade. The Falklands veteran was speaking with a young guard about naval operations, his voice growing stronger as he shared technical details about ship operations that he had kept to himself for years. For Maria, seeing her father's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. As the sun began to set over the palace courtyard, the day that had started with a routine ceremony had become something unprecedented, a celebration of military service that crossed generations, ethnicities, and types of service. The elderly veterans who had arrived that morning feeling invisible were leaving with a renewed sense of connection to the military community they had served. The impact extended beyond the individual veterans to their families and communities. Adult children who had never understood why their parents kept military mementos or remained connected to veterans organizations suddenly saw the deeper meaning of military service. Grandchildren who had dismissed their grandparents' old war stories as irrelevant history began to understand that they were custodians of important family and national heritage. That evening, back in the barracks, the guards who had participated in the day's events gathered for what had become their traditional post-ceremony discussion. But, tonight's conversation was different. They were beginning to understand that their informal policy of acknowledging elderly veterans had grown into something much larger than they had intended. "I think we've started something we can't stop," James said, holding Thomas Brighton's medic pin and thinking about all the stories he had heard that day. "And I'm not sure we should want to stop it." David Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother would say we've awakened something that was always there but had been sleeping." The connection between military generations. As they talked, reports were coming in from other parts of London about elderly veterans sharing their stories with family members for the first time in years, about veterans organizations receiving new membership inquiries, and about museums reporting increased interest in military history exhibits. The Guards had intended to show respect for a few elderly veterans, but they had inadvertently created a movement that was reconnecting British society with its military heritage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as word continued to spread about what was happening at the palace. But, tonight, they could rest knowing that they had honored their military ancestors in the most meaningful way possible, by treating their legacy as a living, breathing part of present-day service. 6 months had passed since that first moment when James stepped forward to acknowledge Albert Thompson, and the transformation at Buckingham Palace had become nothing short of extraordinary. What had begun as a small gesture of respect had evolved into a national movement that was changing how Britain thought about military service and the treatment of elderly veterans. The morning crowd gathered outside the palace gates looked remarkably different from the tourist groups of the past. While visitors still came to see the pageantry and tradition, there was now a significant presence of elderly veterans, their family members, and people who had come specifically to witness the respectful acknowledgments that had become an integral part of the ceremony. James adjusted his ceremonial uniform, now adorned with an additional honor, a small ribbon that Captain Williams had authorized for guards who had demonstrated exceptional dedication to military heritage. It was an unofficial decoration, not recognized in any regulation manual, but it represented something more valuable than any formal medal, the respect of veterans who had served before him. The changes had not been without controversy. Some military traditionalists argued that the guards were straying from their ceremonial duties, while certain palace officials worried about the protocol implications of acknowledging crowds. But the support had far outweighed the criticism, especially after several high-ranking military officials and members of the royal family had privately expressed their approval of the initiative. The most significant change, however, had come from an unexpected source. 3 months earlier, palace officials had received a request for a private meeting from a group of elderly veterans led by Harold Winters, the 98-year-old D-Day veteran who had become an unofficial spokesman for the movement. The meeting had resulted in the establishment of the Military Heritage Recognition Program, a formal but discreet initiative that allowed for scheduled ceremonies honoring different groups of elderly veterans throughout the year. Today was the first of these special ceremonies, designed to honor veterans from the Korean War, a conflict often called the Forgotten War, because its veterans had received limited recognition compared to those from World War II. James felt the weight of responsibility as he prepared to participate in something that had grown far beyond his original intention. Among the Korean War veterans gathered in the courtyard was Robert Chen, a 78-year-old former army medic whose parents had immigrated from China before the war. Robert had served in some of the most brutal fighting of the Korean conflict, including the Battle of the Hook and the defense of the Imjin River. Despite his distinguished service, he had faced discrimination upon his return to Britain and had rarely spoken about his military experiences. Standing beside Robert was Margaret Flynn, one of the few remaining female veterans from Korea, where she had served as a military nurse in mobile surgical units just behind the front lines. At 76, Margaret had spent decades working as a civilian nurse, but her Korean service had been a defining experience that she had kept largely private due to the lack of public interest in the Korean conflict. The ceremony began with the traditional changing of the guard, but the atmosphere was markedly different from standard tourist events. The elderly Korean veterans stood at attention with the discipline of their youth still evident in their bearing. Family members who had come to support them watched with a mixture of pride and amazement. Many were seeing their elderly relatives in military context for the first time. James had studied the history of the Korean War in preparation for this ceremony, and he was struck by how little he had previously known about the conflict. The Korean veterans had fought in conditions as brutal as any in military history: bitter cold, mountainous terrain, and an enemy that used human wave attacks designed to overwhelm United Nations forces. Yet their service had been overshadowed by World War II and, later, by Vietnam. As the formation moved through its positions, James found himself looking directly at Robert Chin. The elderly medic had positioned himself where he could see clearly, his hands folded precisely in front of him in a way that spoke of military training never forgotten. When James offered his respectful nod of acknowledgement, Robert's composure nearly broke. For over 50 years, he had felt like his Korean service didn't matter to anyone except his fellow veterans. Margaret Flynn stood with her daughter Sarah, who had driven up from Brighton specifically for this ceremony. Sarah had never understood why her mother kept a small Korean flag in their family shrine or why she insisted on attending veterans events despite her usually private nature. But, watching the young guard acknowledge her mother's service, Sarah finally began to comprehend the significance of those years her mother had spent in military hospitals on the other side of the world. The ceremony continued with additional acknowledgements from other guards, each recognition carefully planned but appearing spontaneous to observers. Corporal Hayes made eye contact with James Morrison, a 77-year-old artillery veteran who had lost his hearing during the Battle of Kapyong but had never received full disability compensation due to bureaucratic oversights. The moment of recognition from the young soldier meant more to James than any official paperwork ever could. Guardsman Peters acknowledged Ellen Rodriguez, whose husband had been killed in Korea and who had spent decades fighting for proper death benefits for military widows. At 81, Ellen had become an advocate for other military spouses, but she had rarely received recognition for her own sacrifices. The respectful attention from the guard validated not just her late husband's service, but her own lifetime of military community involvement. As the formal ceremony concluded, Captain Williams made an announcement that had been planned but was still emotional for everyone present. Ladies and gentlemen, in recognition of the distinguished service of our Korean War veterans, the palace is honored to present a special acknowledgement ceremony. What followed was unprecedented in palace history. 8 Korean War veterans were invited to approach the guard formation, where they were individually acknowledged by name and service record. Robert Chin, walking with the help of a cane, approached James and accepted a small ceremonial scroll recognizing his service as a combat medic. The scroll was not an official government document, but a recognition created specifically by the guards to honor veterans who had been overlooked for too long. Margaret Flynn received her scroll from Corporal Hayes, who had researched her service record and learned about the mobile surgical units that had saved hundreds of lives under extremely dangerous conditions. As he handed her the recognition, Hayes said quietly, "Ma'am, thank you for your service and your sacrifices. Your work saved the lives of soldiers who came home to their families." Margaret, who had maintained her composure throughout decades of medical emergencies and personal challenges, found herself crying at the simple acknowledgement of her military service. Her daughter Sarah, watching from the crowd, finally understood why her mother had kept that Korean flag all these years. The individual acknowledgements continued, with each veteran receiving recognition that went beyond the scroll to include specific mentions of their service records and contributions. James Morrison, the artillery veteran, learned that the guards had researched the Battle of Kapyong and understood the strategic importance of the actions his unit had taken. Ellen Rodriguez was acknowledged not just as a veteran's widow, but as a military community leader who had helped other families navigate the challenges of military loss. The most moving moment came when the oldest Korean veteran, 91-year-old William Baker, approached the formation. William had served as a communications specialist and had volunteered for some of the most dangerous missions, often operating behind enemy lines to coordinate artillery strikes and evacuation operations. His service record included 3 medals for valor, but he had never received public recognition for his contributions. As William approached James, the elderly veteran's military bearing was evident despite his age. He walked without assistance, his back straight and his eyes clear. When he reached James's position, both men rendered perfect military salutes simultaneously, a moment of respect between soldiers separated by 70 years but united by the understanding of service and sacrifice. "Son," William said quietly, "I've been waiting 50 years for someone in uniform to acknowledge what we did over there. Thank you for remembering us." James felt the full weight of military tradition in that moment. "Sir, your service helped preserve freedom for people who had never heard your names. We remember, and we will continue to remember." The ceremony had attracted media attention, but the coverage was respectful and focused on the veterans rather than the controversy over protocol. The images of elderly Korean veterans being acknowledged by young guards were broadcast across Britain and, internationally, raising awareness about a conflict that had been largely forgotten by popular culture. More importantly, the ceremony had inspired similar recognition events at other military installations across Britain. Army bases, naval facilities, and RAF stations began organizing their own veterans' acknowledgement ceremonies, creating a network of recognition that extended far beyond the palace walls. In the weeks following the Korean War ceremony, something remarkable began happening throughout the country. Veterans from that conflict, many of whom had never discussed their service with their families, began sharing their stories. Adult children learned for the first time about the brutal conditions their parents had faced in Korea, about the friends they had lost, and about the strategic importance of a conflict that had prevented communist expansion in Asia. Robert Chun found himself invited to speak at local schools about his experiences as a medic in Korea. For the first time in his life, he felt that his service was valued by people outside the military community. His stories about treating wounded soldiers in sub-zero temperatures while under enemy fire gave students a new perspective on the courage required for military service. Margaret Flynn was contacted by military historians who wanted to document the experiences of female nurses in Korea. Her detailed accounts of operating mobile surgical units provided valuable historical information that helped complete the record of women's contributions to the conflict. At 76, she became a military historian in her own right. The impact extended beyond the Korean veterans to other groups who had felt overlooked. Veterans from the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Falklands War, and various peacekeeping operations began reaching out to the palace, hoping for similar recognition. The Guards initiative had awakened a hunger for acknowledgement that had been building for decades. James found himself corresponding with veterans from around the world. A former Australian soldier from Vietnam wrote to thank him for starting a movement that had inspired similar recognition ceremonies in Australia. A Canadian veteran of peacekeeping operations in the Balkans expressed gratitude for showing that military service could be honored in ways that went beyond official ceremonies. The correspondence was overwhelming but meaningful. Each letter represented a veteran who had felt invisible but now felt seen, someone whose service had been minimized but was now being acknowledged. James began to understand that the need for recognition was universal among those who had served their countries in difficult circumstances. Captain Williams, who had quietly supported the initiative from the beginning, received official notification that their Veterans Recognition Program was being studied by other Commonwealth militaries as a model for honoring elderly service members. The program had evolved from a potential disciplinary issue into a best practice that was being exported internationally. The transformation at the palace had also affected the Guards themselves in profound ways. James no longer saw his ceremonial duties as mere tradition, he understood them as a living connection to centuries of military service. Every Guard position became an opportunity to honor those who had served before, and every ceremony became a chance to educate the public about military sacrifice. David Hayes had begun studying military history in his spare time, driven by the conversations he had with elderly veterans who visited the palace. He had learned more about British military operations in the 6 months since the initiative began than he had in his entire previous military education. Guardsman Peters had started an informal mentorship program, pairing young soldiers with elderly veterans who visited the palace. The intergenerational connections were benefiting both groups. Young soldiers gained perspective on the long-term meaning of military service, while elderly veterans felt valued and connected to the current military community. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since James first stepped forward to acknowledge Albert Thompson, the palace announced a formal expansion of the Military Heritage Recognition Program. Monthly ceremonies would honor different groups of veterans, ensuring that all conflicts and all types of service would eventually be acknowledged. The announcement included recognition that the initiative had grown from the actions of individual guards who had chosen honor over regulation, who had understood that true military discipline meant respecting the chain of service that connected all generations of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. James stood in the same position where he had made that first small gesture nearly a year earlier, looking out at a crowd that now included hundreds of elderly veterans, their families, and people who had come to witness history being honored. Albert Thompson was there, still carrying his poppy wreath, but now he stood with dozens of other World War II veterans who had found community through the recognition ceremonies. Harold Winters, now 99, was present in his wheelchair, accompanied by several other Normandy veterans who had become regular attendees. Catherine Walsh, the former SOE agent, had brought other female veterans from intelligence and support roles who had rarely been acknowledged in traditional military commemorations. The diversity of service represented in the crowd was extraordinary, veterans from dozens of conflicts, representing every branch of military service and every type of contribution from combat to support to intelligence. They stood together not because they had served in the same units or conflicts, but because they shared the common experience of military service and the common need for recognition and respect. As the ceremony began, James reflected on the simple truth that had started everything, that honor and respect couldn't be contained by regulations, that true military discipline meant acknowledging the sacrifices of those who came before, and that the most important traditions were often the ones that grew from individual acts of courage and compassion. The young guard who had once worried about breaking protocol now understood that the highest form of military discipline was honoring the service of others. In acknowledging elderly veterans, he and his colleagues had discovered the real meaning of the oath they had taken, to serve not just the crown or the country, but the ideals and values that made military service meaningful across generations. The ceremony continued with its perfect precision and formal beauty, but it was no longer just a tourist attraction or a display of tradition. It had become something alive and meaningful, a bridge between past and present, a recognition of service and sacrifice, and a promise that the dedication of military service members would be remembered and honored for as long as young soldiers stood guard and elderly veterans needed acknowledgement. As the final formations moved through their positions, James made eye contact with Albert Thompson one last time. The 93-year-old veteran smiled and raised his hand in a small salute, not the formal military gesture he had offered months earlier, but the quiet acknowledgement between soldiers who understood that true military service was about honoring each other across time, rank, and circumstance. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a moment of compassion had become a movement of recognition, proving that the most powerful military traditions were not those written in regulations, but those that grew from the human understanding that service and sacrifice deserved to be honored, remembered, and passed on to future generations.